The land had been barren for decades, a stretch of forgotten earth just outside the small town of Black Hollow. It was whispered about but never openly discussed. Overgrown with tangled weeds and hemmed in by gnarled trees, the plot of land felt cursed, a presence in the air that made even the most skeptical turn away uneasily. The town's archives contained only fragments of its history, but the story was well known among the older residents. In the late 1700s, a woman named Eleanor Hawthorne was accused of witchcraft and hanged beneath a massive oak tree that once stood at the center of the property. Before her death, she cursed the town, vowing vengeance on anyone who dared to disturb her final resting place. The oak had since withered and died, leaving only its decaying stump behind. Few dared to approach the land, but those who did claimed to hear whispers in the wind and see strange figures in the shadows. But to Nathan Carter, none of this mattered. Nathan Carter leaned against his pickup truck, surveying his newest purchase with a mixture of pride and excitement. 30 acres of land for a price so low, it almost felt like stealing. He'd been struggling to find a property large enough to build the home he'd always dreamed of for his wife and their young daughter, Grace. When the real estate agent mentioned the lot on the outskirts of Black Hollow, he jumped on the opportunity without hesitation. The land stretched out before him, wild and untamed, bordered by dense woods on all sides. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the uneven terrain, but Nathan didn't mind. This was a fresh start for his family, a chance to leave behind the cramped suburban house that no longer felt like home. As he stood there, imagining the possibilities, his wife, Emily, stepped out of the truck with Grace in tow. Emily's auburn hair glinted in the sunlight, and her skeptical expression was impossible to miss. "This is it?" Emily asked, glancing around at the overgrown grass and looming trees. Nathan grinned, throwing an arm around her shoulder. "It's a blank slate, Em. Just imagine it. A big house right there." He pointed to a clearing near the center of the property, and all the space Grace could ever want to run around and play. Grace, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with boundless energy, skipped ahead, her blonde curls bouncing as she twirled through the weeds. "It's huge!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying through the still air. Emily sighed, crossing her arms. "It's definitely something. But why was it so cheap? Did the agent say?" Nathan shrugged, brushing off her concerns. "Apparently, the land's been empty for decades. Nobody's wanted it, so they dropped the price. Their loss is our gain." Emily frowned, glancing toward the tree line. "It just feels strange, like it's too quiet." Nathan laughed, kissing her on the cheek. "You've been in the city too long. You're not used to peace and quiet anymore." Despite his reassurance, Emily couldn't shake the unease that prickled at the back of her mind. There was something about the land, the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, the way the wind rustled through the trees without actually touching them, that made her skin crawl. By the time they returned home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of deep purple and black. Nathan spent the evening drafting plans for their new home, his excitement spilling into every word as he outlined his vision to Emily. She tried to share his enthusiasm, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange quiet of the land. That night, Emily dreamt of shadows. In her dream, she was walking through the property, the tall grass brushing against her legs. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light across the clearing. She could hear whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. Then she saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her face obscured by a veil of black hair. Her dress was tattered and stained, clinging to her frail frame. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though her neck had been broken. Emily tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman raised a bony hand, pointing directly at her, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When Emily woke, her heart was pounding, her skin slick with sweat. Nathan was still asleep beside her, snoring softly. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. It was just a dream, she whispered to herself, trying to push the image of the woman from her thoughts. The next weekend, Nathan brought in a crew to begin clearing the land. He was determined to get the project moving, eager to break ground on the house as soon as possible. Emily stayed behind with Grace, her unease growing with each passing day. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Doors creaking open on their own. The faint smell of smoke that would drift through the house without explanation. Then Grace began talking about her new friend. "She's really nice," Grace said one evening at dinner, her fork pushing peas around her plate. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Who's really nice, kiddo?" "The lady," Grace replied matter-of-factly. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The one who lives on the land," Grace said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She wears a black dress, and her voice sounds funny, like she's whispering all the time." Nathan chuckled, ruffling Grace's hair. "You've got quite the imagination, huh?" But Emily wasn't laughing. "Grace," she said gently, leaning forward. "Did you see her? On the land?" Grace shook her head. "No, she comes here. She talks to me in my room." Nathan and Emily exchanged a look, his smile fading. By the time the foundation for the house was laid, Emily's dreams had grown darker. The woman appeared every night, her whispering voice filling Emily's ears, her outstretched hand beckoning her closer. Nathan dismissed her concerns as stress. "You're just nervous about the move," he said. "It's a big change. Once we're settled, you'll feel better." But Emily wasn't convinced. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, she drove out to the property alone. She needed to see it for herself, to confront the unease that had been growing inside her. The land was quiet when she arrived, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The clearing where the house would stand was freshly leveled, the skeletal framework of the foundation casting long shadows in the fading light. As Emily walked across the clearing, a chill ran down her spine. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable. Then she saw it, the old oak stump, half buried at the edge of the clearing. Something about it drew her closer, a strange compulsion she couldn't resist. Kneeling down, she brushed away the dirt, revealing deep carvings in the wood, symbols she didn't recognize, etched in jagged lines. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. Emily stumbled back, her breath hitching as she turned to run, and froze. A figure stood in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The woman, her head tilted, her lifeless eyes locked on Emily. "Leave," the woman whispered, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Or suffer." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the shadows was unmistakable, the same woman who haunted her dreams. The ghostly figure stood deathly still, her blackened dress fluttering in the faint breeze. Though her face was hidden behind a curtain of matted hair, Emily could feel the weight of her gaze. "Leave," the woman whispered again, her voice an unnatural hiss, low and guttural. Emily stumbled backward, her pulse racing. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground as if the earth itself had grabbed hold of her. The woman took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Stay away," Emily shouted, her voice breaking. The woman raised her hand, bony fingers pointing straight at Emily. A low, mournful wail rose from the clearing, the sound twisting the air around her. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only silence behind. Emily gasped for air, stumbling toward her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As she sped down the darkened road back to town, one thought repeated in her mind like a mantra. "This land is cursed. We can't stay." Nathan was in the garage when Emily burst into the house, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Emily? What's wrong?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. She grabbed his arm, her voice frantic. "We have to stop this. We have to sell the land. It's not safe, Nathan. There's someone there." Nathan frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about? Did something happen?" "Yes," Emily cried, The woman from Grace's stories. She's real. I saw her. She told me to leave. Nathan stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. Emily, you've been under a lot of stress lately. You've been having nightmares. Maybe your mind is playing tricks on you. I'm not imagining this. Emily snapped, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't in my head. Nathan. The land is cursed. That woman, she's dangerous. We can't build a house there. Nathan sighed, placing his hands on her shoulders. Emily, we've already started construction. This is our chance to build the life we've always wanted. We can't just give up because of a few bad dreams. But Emily could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe her. He thought she was overreacting. She didn't argue further. There was no point. But deep down, she knew she was right. That night, the house was eerily quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the old pipes seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Grace was the first to notice something was wrong. "Mommy," she whispered, standing at the foot of Emily's bed in the middle of the night. Emily jolted awake, blinking in the darkness. "Grace? What's wrong, sweetie?" Grace's eyes were wide, her voice trembling. "She's in my room." Emily's heart sank. "Who, baby? Who's in your room?" "The lady," Grace said, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. She was standing in the corner. "She said she's coming for us." Emily pulled Grace into her arms, her stomach twisting with dread. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here. She won't hurt you." But as she held her daughter close, Emily's gaze drifted to the bedroom doorway. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move, just a flicker of darkness against the dim light from the hallway. The next morning, Emily recounted the events of the night to Nathan, but he remained skeptical. "Emily, kids have nightmares. It doesn't mean there's a ghost in the house," he said, sipping his coffee. "It wasn't a nightmare," Emily insisted. "She described the woman perfectly, the same one I saw." Nathan shook his head. "You're letting your imagination run wild. Look, I'll take a night off from the site and stay home. I'll keep an eye on things." "Okay." Emily wanted to scream at his dismissiveness, but she bit her tongue. She couldn't force him to believe her. That evening, Nathan stayed home as promised. He tucked Grace into bed, read her a story, and assured her there were no ghosts in the house. But as the hours ticked by, the uneasy feeling in the air grew heavier. Around midnight, Nathan was jolted awake by a loud thud. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The house was silent for a moment, but then he heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood. He grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the noise. It was coming from Grace's room. "Grace," he called softly, pushing the door open. The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the bed. Grace was fast asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. But on the wall above her bed, long, deep scratches marred the paint. The lines jagged and uneven as though carved by something inhuman. Nathan froze, his blood running cold. The scratching sound came again, this time from the far corner of the room. He swung the flashlight toward the noise, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the corner, stood the woman. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her empty eyes staring directly at him. Her lips parted, and a low, raspy voice filled the room. "You were warned." Nathan stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. He scrambled out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Emily was waiting in the hallway, her face pale. "What happened? What's going on?" Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't. The words caught in his throat as he stared at the bedroom door, his mind racing. He had seen her, and now he believed. The morning after Nathan's terrifying encounter, the Carter family sat in tense silence at the breakfast table. Grace quietly pushed her cereal around her bowl, her usual energy replaced by a pale, tired expression. Emily's eyes were shadowed from another sleepless night, and Nathan. He stared at the floor, gripping his coffee mug with white-knuckled hands. Emily broke the silence. "You believe me now, don't you?" Nathan didn't look up, but he nodded. "I saw her," he said quietly. "She was in Grace's room. I don't know what she is, But she's real. Grace's head snapped up. She's not mean to me, she said softly. She says she's sad. She says people hurt her. Emily and Nathan exchanged a worried glance. Sweetheart, Emily said, her voice trembling. Did she tell you what happened to her? Grace nodded slowly. She said they called her a bad name. A witch. She said she didn't do anything wrong. But they hurt her anyway. She said she just wants to be left alone. Nathan set his mug down, his jaw tightening. This is my fault, he said. I should have listened to you, Emily. I should have looked into the land before buying it. Emily placed a hand on his arm. We need to find out more about her. If we can figure out what happened, maybe we can stop this. Later that day, Nathan and Emily visited the Black Hollow Historical Society. The small, dusty office was tucked away on the edge of Main Street, run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove. She greeted them with a warm, if curious, smile. Can I help you folks? She asked, adjusting her thick glasses. Nathan cleared his throat. We recently bought the land on the outskirts of town. The one with the old oak stump. We've been experiencing some strange things, and we think it might be tied to the history of the land. Mrs. Hargrove's smile faded. She folded her hands on the desk and leaned forward. That land is cursed, she said bluntly. Everyone in town knows it, though most folks don't talk about it. You're not the first to disturb it, and you won't be the first to regret it. Emily swallowed hard. What happened there? Mrs. Hargrove sighed, her eyes distant. The land once belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hawthorne. This was back in the late 1700s. She lived alone, kept to herself. People in the town didn't trust her, called her a witch because she knew about herbs and healing. When a sickness swept through the town, folks blamed her. Said she cursed them. Nathan frowned. Did she? No, Mrs. Hargrove said firmly. Eleanor was innocent. But that didn't stop the mob. They dragged her out of her home, accused her of witchcraft, and hanged her from the old oak tree. Before she died, she cursed the land and everyone who dared to touch it. Said her spirit would never rest until justice was done. Emily's breath caught. Justice? What does that mean? Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. That's the thing about curses. They're not always clear. But everyone who's tried to live on that land has suffered for it. Strange accidents, disappearances, even deaths. You should leave while you still can. That night, the family huddled together in the living room, the flickering light of the television doing little to chase away the heavy silence. Grace sat curled up on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Mrs. Hargrove said to leave. Emily said softly, breaking the silence. Nathan ran a hand through his hair. And go where? We've sunk everything we have into that land. We can't just walk away. We don't have a choice. Emily snapped. That woman, Eleanor. She's not going to stop. She's already coming after Grace. Grace looked up, her voice small. She doesn't want to hurt me. She wants you to listen. Listen to what, Grace? Nathan asked, his voice gentle. Grace hesitated, her eyes darting to the shadows in the room. She says, she needs something. Something that was taken from her. She says if we find it, she'll go away. Emily and Nathan exchanged a troubled glance. What was taken from her? Emily asked. I don't know, Grace whispered. But she says it's buried under the tree. The next day, Nathan returned to the property with a shovel. The old oak stump loomed at the edge of the clearing, its gnarled roots twisting into the earth like skeletal fingers. The ground around it was uneven, the soil darker than the rest of the land. Emily and Grace stayed in the car, watching from a safe distance as Nathan began to dig. Each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted him. Hours passed, the sun sinking lower in the sky. Nathan was about to give up when the shovel struck something solid. His pulse quickened as he dropped to his knees, brushing the dirt away with his hands. Beneath the soil, he uncovered a small wooden box, its surface cracked and weathered with age. Nathan hesitated, his hands trembling as he lifted the box from the ground. He pried it open, revealing its contents. A bundle of dried herbs, a small leather-bound book, and a necklace with a pendant shaped like a crescent moon. "Is that it?" Emily called from the car. "I think so," Nathan replied, his voice shaking. But as he stood there, holding the box, the air around him grew colder. A low, mournful wail echoed through the clearing, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in on him from all sides. Before Nathan could react, the figure of Eleanor emerged from the shadows. Her form was more solid now, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes burning with anger. "Why have you disturbed my rest?" she demanded, her voice echoing unnaturally. Nathan swallowed hard. "We're trying to help you." Grace said, "You need something that was taken from you." Eleanor's gaze shifted to the box in his hands. For a moment, the anger in her expression softened, replaced by sorrow. "My book," she whispered. "My necklace. They called them the tools of a witch. They buried them here to mock me, to trap me in this place." Nathan took a cautious step forward, holding the box out to her. "If we give these back to you, will you leave us alone?" Eleanor stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Return them to the tree. Only then will I rest." Nathan stood beneath the gnarled remains of the oak tree, the box in his hands feeling heavier with every passing second. Emily and Grace stood a few feet behind him, their faces pale and their breaths clouding the chilly night air. The forest around them was unnaturally quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "What happens if this doesn't work?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan didn't answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that they had no other choice. Eleanor's spectral form hovered nearby, her hollow eyes fixed on the box. She had grown more solid since they unearthed her belongings, her presence colder and heavier. "Place them where the roots touch the earth," Eleanor said, her voice soft yet commanding. Nathan hesitated, then knelt by the base of the tree. The roots jutted out of the ground like skeletal hands, their twisted shapes casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. He carefully placed the leather-bound book, the bundle of herbs, and the crescent moon necklace on the damp soil. Eleanor stepped closer, her translucent form wavering as if caught between worlds. She stretched out her hands, and the objects began to glow faintly. The air around them grew thick with the scent of burned sage and damp earth. But then, something went wrong. The ground beneath the tree began to shake violently, sending Nathan sprawling backward. Emily screamed, grabbing Grace and pulling her away as cracks spiderwebbed through the earth. "What's happening?" Nathan shouted, scrambling to his feet. Eleanor's form flickered, her once soft expression twisting into a mask of anguish. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They bound me to this place with more than earth and stone. Their hatred, their fear. It lingers still." The glowing light around the objects intensified, blinding them momentarily. When the light dimmed, the tree's stump had split open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From the depths of the pit came an unnatural sound, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. "What is that?" Emily gasped, clutching Grace tightly. Eleanor turned to them, her face grave. "It is their hatred made flesh. The curse is more than my pain. It is the town's sin, their vengeance. And now it is awake." A figure began to rise from the pit, its form obscured by swirling shadows. It was massive, hunched, and grotesque, its skin a mottled gray that shimmered unnaturally in the moonlight. Its eyes burned red, and its jagged mouth opened in a snarl that made the air vibrate with malice. Nathan stepped in front of his family, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do we do?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Eleanor didn't answer. Her form was fading, her connection to the world growing weaker as the creature grew stronger. "I cannot stop it," she said, her voice faint. "But you must. You must destroy the source of its power." "The source?" Emily asked, her voice frantic. "What is it?" Eleanor's gaze shifted to the objects on the ground. "The book. It holds their hate. Destroy it, and the curse will break." The creature lunged toward them with a deafening roar, its massive claws ripping through the air. Nathan grabbed a fallen branch and swung it wildly, the improvised weapon doing little more than enraging the beast. "Run," he shouted, turning to Emily and Grace. Emily hesitated, but the terror in Grace's eyes spurred her into action. She grabbed her daughter's hand and ran toward the car, glancing back only once to see Nathan standing his ground. The creature swiped at Nathan, knocking him to the ground with a force that left him gasping for air. It loomed over him, its red eyes glowing with hatred. "Destroy the book," Nathan shouted, his voice hoarse. "Emily, burn it." Emily skidded to a halt near the car, fumbling through her bag for a lighter. Her hands trembled as she lit the flame, the small spark barely illuminating the dark forest. Grace tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, hurry. I'm trying." Emily snapped, her voice shaking. She crouched near the tree stump, holding the lighter to the edges of the book. The old, dry pages caught quickly, the fire spreading in seconds. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, its form writhing as if in agony. It turned toward the burning book, its red eyes narrowing with rage. Eleanor's voice rang out, faint but determined. "Do not stop. It must burn completely." Nathan staggered to his feet, his body aching. He grabbed another branch and swung it at the creature, buying Emily time as the flames consumed the cursed book. As the last page of the book turned to ash, the creature let out a final, deafening roar. Its form began to dissolve, the shadows peeling away like smoke in the wind. The earth beneath the tree trembled once more, and then, all at once, the night fell silent. Nathan collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Emily ran to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eleanor's fading form appeared one last time, her expression calm. "The curse is lifted. You have freed me, and yourselves." She gave them a small, sad smile before vanishing into the night, her spirit finally at rest. In the weeks that followed, the Carters decided to leave Black Hollow for good. The land was sold to the town, marked as a protected site to ensure no one disturbed it again. Nathan, Emily, and Grace moved into a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the haunted memories of the cursed land. But sometimes, late at night, Grace would wake from a dream, her voice soft and certain. "She's happy now," she would say. "She's free." And though the nightmares were gone, the Carters would never forget the dark, terrifying lesson they had learned. Some curses are born not from evil, but from pain. And sometimes, the only way to break them is to face the truth.